Welcome back to another dive deep into the shadows of history to uncover the most fascinating and notorious crimes. Today we journey back to the 18th century to explore the life of one of England's most infamous figures, Richard Turpin, better known as Dick Turpin, the legendary highwayman whose name has echoed through the ages. Richard Turpin was born in the Bluebell Inn, later known as the Rose and Crown, in Hampstead, Essex. He was the fifth of 6 children born to John Turpin, a butcher and innkeeper, and Mary Elizabeth Parmenter. On September 21st, 1705, young Richard was baptized in the same parish where his parents had married over a decade earlier. The Turpin family lived a modest life, with John Turpin's dual trades as a butcher and innkeeper providing for his family. It's said that young Dick followed in his father's footsteps, learning the butchery trade. Some stories suggest that he served as an apprentice to a butcher in Whitechapel as a teenager, while others hint that he may have even opened his own butcher's shop in the village of Thaxted. Testimony from his later trial in 1739 indicates that by around 1725, Dick Turpin had married Elizabeth Millington, though the exact date of their union remains unclear. Evidence from his trial also suggests that Turpin received a basic education, likely enough to manage a trade. After his apprenticeship, Turpin and his wife moved north to Buckhurst Hill in Essex, where he set up a butcher's shop. It might have seemed that Turpin was on a path to an ordinary, if not prosperous, life. But the course of his life would soon take a sharp turn. Though he began as a tradesman, Turpin's life of crime was about to unfold, leading him down a path from butcher to burglar, poacher, horse thief, and eventually a feared highwayman. His transformation is a tale that has fascinated people for centuries. But behind the myths and legends lies the story of a man whose choices led him into a life of infamy and ultimately to the gallows. As we delve deeper into the life of Dick Turpin, we find that his descent into crime was not a sudden leap, but rather a gradual slide. In the early 1730s, Turpin likely became entangled with the notorious Essex gang of deer thieves. At the time, deer poaching was rampant in the Royal Forest of Waltham, a crime that had become so widespread that it prompted a harsh legislative response. The 1723 Black Act was introduced, making it illegal to blacken or disguise one's face while in the forests, among other offenses. This act was aimed at curbing the growing lawlessness in areas like Waltham, where poaching had become almost a way of life for some. Deer stealing, while serious, was initially dealt with by local justices of the peace rather than through the civil courts. It wasn't until 1737 that the punishment escalated to the severe sentence of 7 years transportation. However, by 1731, the situation had grown so dire that the Duke of Newcastle responded by offering a £10 reward, equivalent to over £1,500 today, for anyone who could identify the thieves. Additionally, a pardon was offered to those involved who were willing to betray their comrades. Following a series of nasty incidents, the government increased the reward to £50 by 1733, a substantial sum in those days. The Essex gang, sometimes referred to as the Gregory Gang after one of its leaders, Samuel Gregory, was a rough and ready crew. Alongside Samuel were his brothers Jeremiah and Jasper, as well as a motley group including Joseph Rose, Mary Brazier, who acted as the gang's fence, John Jones, Thomas Rowden, and a young John Wheeler. These men needed reliable contacts to help them dispose of the stolen deer, and it was here that Dick Turpin, then a young butcher trading in the area, almost certainly became involved. While there is no direct evidence that Turpin himself was stealing deer, by the summer of 1734, he had become closely associated with the gang. This close relationship suggests that Turpin had been intertwined with their criminal activities for some time, setting the stage for his evolution from a petty accomplice to one of England's most feared outlaws. By October 1734, the Essex gang was beginning to feel the heat. Several members had been captured or had fled, forcing the gang to shift their focus from poaching to more audacious and brutal crimes. Their first major target during this period was the home of Peter Split, a chandler and grocer in Woodford. Although the identities of all the perpetrators remain uncertain, Turpin is strongly suspected to have been involved. But they didn't stop there. Just 2 nights later, the gang struck again, this time targeting the home of Richard Woolridge, a gentleman and furnisher of small arms for the Office of Ordnance at the Tower of London. These raids marked a significant escalation in the gang's activities, demonstrating their growing boldness and desperation. In December of that year, the gang launched another vicious attack, this time on the home of John Gladwin, a peddler, and John Shockley in Chingford. Then, on December 19th, Turpin, along with 5 other men, raided the home of Ambrose Skinner, a 73-year-old farmer from Barking. They left with an estimated £300, a staggering sum, equivalent to over £40,000 today. This robbery further cemented Turpin's reputation as a ruthless criminal, willing to target even the elderly for profit. Just 2 days later, the gang, this time without Turpin, attacked the home of William Mason, a keeper in Epping Forest. Although Mason's servant managed to escape and return with help, it was too late. The gang had already ransacked the house and fled into the night. The gang's spree continued into the new year. On January 11, 1735, they raided the Charlton home of a Mr. Saunders. Only a week later, Turpin, masked and armed with pistols, led a raid on the home of a gentleman named Sheldon in Croydon, accompanied by 4 other gang members. The same month, 2 men, likely from the gang, brutally attacked the home of Reverend Mr. Dyde. Although the clergyman was absent, they viciously cut his manservant's face, leaving a trail of blood and fear in their wake. One of the most heinous of these crimes occurred on February 1st, 1735, in Loughton. That night, 5 rogues, likely including Turpin, burst into the home of Widow Shelley. Armed with pistols, they threatened to murder the elderly lady unless she revealed the location of her money. Despite their threats, she refused to speak. The gang, growing increasingly desperate, threatened to lay her across the fire. Her son, witnessing the terror, finally broke down and revealed the hiding place to save his mother. The gang then ransacked the home, taking nearly £100, a silver tankard, and other valuable household goods. While this was happening, 2 of the gang members robbed a nearby farmer, Mr. Turkles, of over £20. After spending nearly 3 hours terrorizing the household, the gang finally made their escape, taking 2 of the farmer's horses to carry off their loot. This series of crimes, reported in Red's Weekly Journal on February 8, 1735, paints a vivid picture of the escalating violence and lawlessness of Turpin and his gang. It was no longer just about survival or petty theft. It was about instilling fear, taking what they wanted by force, and living large off the spoils. The gang remained in and around London, living a life of crime that grew increasingly violent and desperate. Turpin, along with his fellow criminals, moved frequently to avoid capture, with Turpin himself staying in Whitechapel for a time before relocating to Millbank. On February 4th, 1735, Turpin met with other members of the gang at an inn along the Broadway in London, where they hatched a plan to rob the home of Joseph Lawrence, a farmer at Earlsbury Farm in Edgware. That evening, the gang set their plan in motion. They captured a shepherd boy to prevent him from raising the alarm, and then stormed the house, armed with pistols. Inside, they bound the maidservants and launched a brutal assault on the 70-year-old farmer. Despite their relentless and sadistic torture, beating him with pistols, scalding him with hot water, and dragging him by his nose and hair, Lawrence refused to reveal where his money was hidden. After all their brutality, the gang escaped with less than 30 pounds, a paltry sum for the sheer violence they inflicted on their victims. This robbery, like many others, exemplifies the gang's escalating cruelty and the increasingly dangerous life Turpin was leading, as they continued to terrorize those unfortunate enough to cross their path. The gang's brutality continued to escalate, and in response to these growing threats, the Duke of Newcastle offered a £50 reward for any information leading to the conviction of those responsible for the recent spate of robberies. On February 11th, fate began to turn against the gang. 3 members, John Fielder, William Saunders, and John Wheeler, were apprehended, though the exact circumstances of their capture remain debated. One account suggests that, while on their way to rob the Lawrence household, the gang had stopped at an alehouse in Edgware. Days later, the alehouse owner, while walking through Bloomsbury, noticed a group of horses outside another alehouse. Recognizing them as the same horses used by the men who had visited his establishment before the Lawrence robbery, he alerted the parish constable. Another version claims that 2 of the gang members were spotted by a servant of Joseph Lawrence, leading to their capture. Regardless of the precise details, the 3 men were arrested while drinking with a woman, possibly Mary Brazier, and were quickly committed to prison. Wheeler, who was possibly as young as 15, wasted no time betraying his comrades, providing detailed descriptions that were swiftly circulated in the press. The London Gazette described Turpin as Richard Turpin, a butcher by trade, is a tall, fresh-colored man, very much marked with the smallpox, about 26 years of age, about 5 feet 9 inches high, lived some time ago in Whitechapel, and did lately lodge somewhere about Millbank, Westminster. Wears a blue-gray coat and a natural wig. With his identity now widely known, the net was closing in on Turpin, marking the beginning of the end for one of England's most infamous highwaymen. When John Wheeler's confession became known, panic set in among the remaining members of the Essex gang. They quickly fled their usual hideouts, fearing imminent capture. Dick Turpin, aware of Wheeler's betrayal, warned the others before leaving Westminster. On February 15, 1735, while Wheeler was spilling the gang's secrets to the authorities, Turpin, along with other members of the gang, carried out another brazen robbery, this time targeting the house of Mrs. St. John in Chingford. The very next day, Turpin parted ways with the rest of the gang and headed for Hempstead, likely seeking refuge with his family. Meanwhile, Samuel Gregory and Thomas Haynes seemed to have been trying to regroup, possibly searching for Turpin. On February 17th, they stopped at an alehouse in Debden, planning to stay the night. Unfortunately for them, a man named Palmer recognized the 2 and alerted the parish constable. A scuffle ensued, but Gregory and Haynes managed to escape, later reuniting with Turpin. Together they, along with other gang members, might have made their way to Gravesend before returning to Woodford. However, with the authorities closing in, the gang was forced to lay low, likely hiding in the dense cover of Epping Forest. As the noose tightened, the gang's luck continued to unravel. Just 6 days after Fielder, Saunders, and Wheeler were captured, another blow struck the crew. Joseph Rose, Mary Brazier, and Humphrey Walker were apprehended while drinking punch at a chandler's shop in Westminster. Their trials quickly followed, and by early March 1735, Fielder, Rose, Saunders, and Walker had been sentenced at the Middlesex General Session. Turpin and Gregory were named in the indictments for burglary, though they remained at large. Walker didn't survive long enough to face the gallows, dying in Newgate Prison. However, the others were hanged at Tyburn on March 10th, and their bodies were gruesomely displayed in gibbets along Edgware Road as a stark warning to would-be criminals. Despite these losses, Turpin and his remaining associates continued to operate in the shadows, but the gang's days were numbered. Jasper Gregory was captured and executed in March. His brothers, Samuel and Jeremy Gregory, met similar fates. On April 9th, after a fierce struggle in Rake, West Sussex, Samuel lost the tip of his nose in a sword fight, and Jeremy was shot in the leg. Jeremy died in Winchester Jail, while Samuel was tried in May and executed on June 4th. His body, too, was hung in chains alongside his fellow gang members on Edgware Road. Mary Brazier, the gang's fence, avoided the gallows, but was transported to the 13 colonies. Herbert Haynes, another key member, was captured on April 13th and met his end in August. John Wheeler, whose confession had set the gang's downfall in motion, was spared by the authorities, only to die in January 1738 in Hackney, his death assumed to be from natural causes. With the Essex gang dismantled by the authorities, Dick Turpin turned to the crime that would cement his infamy: highway robbery. Though he may have participated in earlier robberies, Turpin was first identified as a suspect in a highway robbery on July 10th, where he was recognized as Turpin the Butcher, alongside his accomplice Thomas Rowden, known as the Pewterer. Just days later, the pair struck again in Epping Forest, robbing a man from Southwark of his belongings. With a substantial bounty of £100 on their heads, Turpin and Rowden continued their criminal activities throughout the latter half of 1735. However, by late December, following the capture of another gang member, John Jones, Turpin and Rowden went their separate ways. Rowden, who had a prior conviction for counterfeiting, continued his criminal exploits under the alias Daniel Crispy. He was eventually caught passing counterfeit coins in July 1736, and after his true identity was uncovered, he was transported to the colonies in June 1738. Jones also faced transportation to the 13 colonies. During 1736, Turpin's movements became more elusive. Reports surfaced of him possibly traveling to Holland, though it's just as likely he assumed an alias and went into hiding. By February 1737, however, he resurfaced, spending the night at Puckeridge with his wife, her maid, and a man named Robert Knott. Turpin had arranged the meeting by letter, but the authorities intercepted it. While Turpin managed to escape to Cambridge, the others were arrested and imprisoned at Hertford Jail on charges of violent suspicion of being dangerous rogues and robbing upon the highway. The women were later acquitted, and Knott was eventually released. In March 1737, Dick Turpin teamed up with two other highwaymen, Matthew King and Stephen Potter, for a series of robberies. Their crime spree came to a sudden halt after a dramatic incident in Whitechapel, where a stolen horse led to a confrontation. Matthew King was fatally wounded, and Stephen Potter was later captured, but released due to insufficient evidence. This marked the beginning of the end for Turpin, as the authorities began closing in on him, leading to his eventual downfall. In June 1737, Dick Turpin, using the alias John Palmer, settled at the Ferry Inn in Brough, posing as a respectable horse trader. He blended in with the local gentry, maintaining a facade while traveling across the River Humber. However, Turpin's reckless behavior soon exposed him. After brazenly shooting another man's gamecock and threatening a local, the incident drew the attention of 3 justices of the peace. When Turpin refused to pay the required surety, he was committed to the House of Correction at Beverley. As Turpin remained in custody, the justices investigated his background and uncovered suspicions of theft and escape from Long Sutton, Lincolnshire. Realizing the severity of his crimes, they ordered his transfer to York Castle on October 16, 1738, where he would face justice. Horse theft, a capital offense since 1545, was treated with utmost severity during the 17th and 18th centuries, a time when property crimes were among the most harshly punished. Dick Turpin, operating under his alias, had stolen several horses, He had taken the stolen horse to visit his father in Hempstead, and, on his return to Bra, stole 3 more horses along the way, leaving a gelding with his father, John Turpin. Given the notoriety of John Turpin's son, the stolen horse was quickly identified, and on September 12, 1738, John Turpin was imprisoned in Essex on charges of horse theft. After assisting in preventing a jailbreak, the charges against John Turpin were dropped, but it was for these horse thefts that Dick Turpin was ultimately tried and executed. A month after Dick Turpin, under his alias of John Palmer, was transferred to York Castle, Thomas Creasy, the owner of the stolen horses, tracked them down and recovered them, leading to Turpin's eventual trial. While in his cell, Turpin wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, Pomper Rivernall, but Rivernall refused to pay the postage. The letter ended up in Saffron Walden, where it was recognized by James Smith, a former schoolmate who had taught Dick Turpin to write. Smith alerted local Justice Thomas Stubbing, who opened the letter. On February 23, 1739, Smith traveled to York Castle and identified John Palmer as Dick Turpin. For this, he received a £200 reward, over £40,000 today, marking the end of Turpin's life as a fugitive and paving the way for his infamous trial. Despite some initial debate over where Dick Turpin's trial should take place, the Duke of Newcastle had pushed for it to be held in London. Turpin ultimately faced justice at York Assizes. The trial began on March 22, 1739, 3 days after the Winter Assizes opened. Turpin was charged with the theft of 3 horses belonging to Thomas Creasy, a mare valued at £3, a foal worth 20 shillings, and a gelding valued at £3. The indictments described the crimes as having occurred in Welton on March 1, 1739, and referred to the defendant as John Palmer, alias Palmer, alias Richard Turpin, late of the Castle of York in the county of York, labourer. However, the charges were technically flawed. The actual thefts had taken place in Heckington, not Welton, and in August 1738, not March. The trial was overseen by Sir William Chappell, a respected judge in his 60s. The prosecution was led by King's Counsel Thomas Place and Richard Crowell, with proceedings recorded by local resident Thomas Kyle. Turpin, like many at the time, could not afford a defense barrister, so the judge nominally looked after his interests. The prosecution called 7 witnesses, including Thomas Creasy and James Smith, who had identified Turpin's handwriting. Turpin offered little defense, merely asking for a delay in the trial, which was denied. When questioned, Turpin claimed he bought the stolen horses from an innkeeper and used the alias Palmer because it was his mother's maiden name. However, when pressed by the judge, he admitted his true name, Turpin. The jury, without leaving the courtroom, found Turpin guilty of the first charge of stealing the mare and foal, and after further proceedings, also guilty of stealing the gelding. Throughout the trial, Turpin protested that he had not been given sufficient time to prepare his defense, that the proceedings should be delayed until he could call his witnesses, and that the trial should have been held in Essex. But when the judge asked Turpin if he could offer any reason why he should not be sentenced to death, Turpin could only say, "It is very hard upon me, my lord, because I was not prepared for my defense." The judge responded, "Why was you not? You knew the time of the assizes as well as any person here." Despite Turpin's insistence that he had been led to believe the trial would be held in Essex, the judge replied, "Whoever told you so were highly to blame, and as your country have found you guilty of a crime worthy of death, it is my office to pronounce sentence against you." With those words, Dick Turpin was sentenced to death, sealing the fate of one of England's most notorious highwaymen. In the days leading up to his execution, Dick Turpin received numerous visitors while imprisoned. The jailer reportedly made a small fortune, around £100, by selling drinks to Turpin and his guests, capitalizing on the morbid curiosity surrounding the notorious highwayman. Unfazed by his impending fate, Turpin purchased a new frock coat and shoes for his impending execution. On April 7, 1739, Dick Turpin, along with John Stead, another convicted horse thief, was taken through the streets of York in an open cart, followed by mourners hired and paid for by Turpin himself. Their destination was Knavesmire, York's equivalent of London's Tyburn Gallows. Turpin, displaying a remarkable degree of composure, or perhaps bravado, bowed to the spectators as he passed by, behaved himself with amazing assurance, as one account put it. According to the Gentleman's Magazine, Turpin's final moments were marked by his characteristic brashness. As he mounted the ladder, he felt his right leg tremble, but quickly steadied himself, exchanged a few words with the topsman, and then threw himself off the ladder, expiring within 5 minutes. Turpin was executed using the short drop method, which meant death came slowly by strangulation rather than the swift, neck-breaking drop used in later executions. His body was left hanging until late afternoon, after which it was cut down and taken to a tavern in Castlegate. The next morning, Turpin's body was buried in the graveyard of St. George's Church in Fishergate, opposite what is now the Roman Catholic St. George's Church. However, Turpin's story didn't end with his burial. On the Tuesday following his interment, body snatchers reportedly stole his corpse, a common practice at the time as cadavers were in high demand for medical research. Although the authorities in York may have turned a blind eye to such activities, the general public was outraged. A mob quickly apprehended the body snatchers, recovered Turpin's body, and reburied it, this time supposedly with quicklime to prevent further tampering. While it's believed that Turpin's remains still lie in St. George's graveyard, there is still some doubt about the authenticity of the grave. The legend of Dick Turpin, like his life, is shrouded in both fact and myth. As we reflect on the legacy of Dick Turpin, it's clear that much of what we know about him is a blend of fact and fiction, shaped over centuries by a mixture of truth and embellishment. One of the key sources fueling the legend is Richard Bayes's The Genuine History of the Life of Richard Turpin, published in 1739. This book, hurriedly assembled after Turpin's trial, was a combination of factual accounts and imaginative storytelling, crafted to satisfy a gullible and eager public. During the late 17th and early 18th centuries, literature about condemned criminals, their trials, and their lives was incredibly popular. These accounts were the precursors to the modern novel, providing a blend of news, moral reflection, and entertainment. They were produced on an unprecedented scale, serving as a medium through which society could explore its anxieties about crime, punishment, and morality. Turpin's story, like those of many infamous figures, has been shaped by this genre of literature, turning him from a mere highwayman into a figure of folklore. The speeches of the condemned, the sensationalized biographies, and the trial reports were all part of a broader cultural conversation about sin, salvation, and the workings of providence. In many ways, Turpin's legacy is a reflection of the society that both feared and fascinated itself with crime, a society that used these stories to negotiate its own moral boundaries. Today, as we look back on Turpin's life, we must acknowledge that while some aspects of his story are rooted in reality, much of what we think we know has been filtered through the lens of myth and legend. The true Dick Turpin was a far cry from the romanticized figure of popular imagination, yet his story continues to captivate, a testament to the enduring power of storytelling in shaping history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Dick Turpin. If you enjoyed this exploration of true crime from history, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with others who might find it fascinating. We've got plenty more intriguing stories from the past lined up, so make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and brings history to life. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.